The morning light entered the Wright mansion like a silent guest, spilling warmth over marble floors that felt too cold to belong to a home. Maria Chen Wright stood in the kitchen, her fingers loosely holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She didn't even notice. Her gaze fixed on the Los Angeles skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. From up here, the city looked peaceful, almost dreamlike, but she knew better. Down there, people loved, fought, struggled, and survived. While up here, she lived in a kind of beautiful emptiness, the sort that echoed through halls lined with expensive art and untouched furniture. It had been exactly 2 years since she had become Mrs. Daniel Wright, the wife of one of America's youngest billionaires. Her wedding had made headlines for its glamour. Her dress had been designed by an Italian legend. The guest list had included names that could move markets, and yet behind all that glitter there had been nothing real, not even a spark of connection after 2 years. Daniel had never truly touched her, not with love, not with warmth, not with the kind of tenderness she secretly dreamed of when she watched old movies about love that could melt walls. Theirs was a marriage of silence, of politeness, of perfectly timed nods and perfectly spaced footsteps. Daniel Wright was not cruel. He was simply distant. He was the kind of man who spoke in numbers and decisions, who lived by logic and control, who smiled rarely and felt like a stranger even when he sat across from her at dinner. The house itself reflected his soul, orderly, immaculate and lifeless every morning. Daniel left for work at 6, and every evening he returned at 8. Always the same rhythm, like a machine built for success but not for emotion. Sometimes Maria wondered if he ever looked at her when she wasn't watching, if there was ever a flicker of something in him that he tried to bury. But the silence between them was too wide to cross. Maria's only solace was her work. She was a designer, not of fashion or buildings, but of feelings. She created wellness apps, digital sanctuaries where people could breathe, meditate, and find calm. Ironically, she was designing peace for others while she herself lived in quiet chaos. Her mornings started with pixels, colors, and soft gradients on a screen, and her nights ended in a king-sized bed that felt like an island. She often stared at the ceiling, wondering how 2 people could sleep so close and yet live in different worlds. Her father's death had changed everything. Robert Chen had been a man of ambition but also of secrets. When he died suddenly, Maria was left with grief, and with debts she had never imagined. It was Daniel who had appeared then, offering marriage in the name of security. He had been her father's business partner, and at that time, she thought his proposal was born from kindness or loyalty. It wasn't love, but she had told herself maybe love could grow. Maybe proximity could soften the edges, but it never did. The housekeeper, Grace Park, entered the kitchen quietly that morning. Grace had silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. She had served the Wright family for decades, long before Maria became part of it. "Good morning, Mrs. Wright," she said softly, placing a vase of white lilies on the counter. "These just arrived from Mr. Wright, I assume." Maria's lips twitched into a smile that wasn't quite real. Every Monday flowers came, fresh, expensive, meaningless. "Thank you, Grace," she replied. "You can put them with the others." The others, dozens of bouquets, all white, lined the hallway like ghostly reminders of a relationship that never lived. Grace hesitated before leaving. "He left early again this morning," she said gently. "Didn't have breakfast." Maria nodded without looking up. "I know," she whispered. When Grace left, silence returned. Maria opened her laptop and lost herself in work. Hours slipping by unnoticed. Around noon, she decided to stretch her legs and wandered through the house, passing the grand piano she never learned to play, the library filled with books Daniel probably never read, and the dining table that had hosted more meetings than meals. When she reached the corridor leading to Daniel's private study, she paused. That room had always felt off limits, but something about today was different. A strange curiosity stirred inside her. She tried the handle. It was unlocked inside. The study smelled of leather and power. The walls were lined with certificates, awards, and photos. Daniel shaking hands with other powerful men. Daniel standing beside sleek cars. Daniel in tailored suits, but nowhere, not once, was there a picture of them together. His desk was spotless, his laptop closed, his pen aligned with mathematical precision. Maria knew she shouldn't invade his privacy, yet a quiet urge pushed her toward the massive bookshelf behind his desk. It was there she noticed a faint irregularity. One panel slightly misaligned. She touched it and it moved, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single leather folder, old and worn. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated, but the silence of the house seemed to whisper, "Open it." Her fingers trembled as she untied the thin cord, and when she saw what was inside, her world tilted. There were printed emails between her father and Daniel. The subject lines blurred before her eyes, but one stood out in cruel clarity. Proposal for merger via marriage. Her breath caught. She read on, "Robert, if you agree to the marriage, I will transfer 40% of Chen Industries to Daniel Wright. The union will stabilize both companies and ensure your debts are erased." That was her father's writing, his signature at the bottom like a betrayal carved in ink. Below it, Daniel's reply, "Agreed, I will proceed as discussed. All arrangements should remain confidential." Maria felt something inside her crack. The truth unfolded painfully. She had not been chosen. She had been traded. The marriage was never about love or even compassion. It was a transaction, a contract wrapped in wedding vows. Her father had sold his daughter to save his empire, and Daniel had bought a wife to gain control. Every touch he had withheld now made sense. It wasn't restraint, it was disinterest. She wasn't his partner. She was his price for several minutes. She couldn't move. The letters trembled in her hands as her chest rose and fell too fast. Finally, she placed everything back carefully, tied the cord, and closed the hidden compartment. The room felt suffocating now, heavy with the weight of lies. She walked out, her legs weak, her eyes unfocused. The house that had once seemed cold now felt poisonous. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the sheets, trying to understand how her life had become a chessboard for men who saw her as a piece to be moved. Her father was gone, Daniel was unreachable, and she was a ghost in her own life. For years she had told herself Daniel was distant because of grief, or pride, or some wound she couldn't see. Now she realized he had simply fulfilled his end of a deal, no more, no less. When the clock struck 3, Maria drove to meet her best friend, Jennifer Lopez, not the singer, but a woman with energy and heart enough to fill a room. Jennifer had been there through college, through her father's funeral, through the endless nights of confusion and heartbreak. They met at Sunset Cafe, a small, warm place that smelled of roasted beans and fresh bread. Jennifer's face lit up when she saw her, but it quickly dimmed. "You look pale, Maria," she said, reaching across the table. "What happened?" Maria tried to smile, but her throat burned. "I found something," she whispered. "Something about Daniel and my father." She told her everything. Every word, every email. When she finished, Jennifer's eyes were wide. "Maria, that's awful," she said. "You can't stay in that house, not after knowing this." "I don't know," Maria murmured. "Where would I go? Everything I have is tied to him. My father's debts, my company, even this name." She touched her wedding ring unconsciously, the diamond glinting under the cafe's light. "It's strange," she continued softly. "I thought I'd feel anger, but all I feel is empty. As if my life was written by someone else and I'm just reading the script." Jennifer leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time to write your own." The words lingered with Maria long after she drove home. She passed the iron gates, the manicured lawns, the guards who nodded respectfully, and parked her car in silence. The sun was setting, and the mansion glowed with golden light, but it felt unreal. She walked through the empty corridors, each step echoing like a question. Later that night, she heard the familiar sound of Daniel's car in the driveway, followed by his calm footsteps. He entered the house, removed his jacket, and glanced at her briefly when he saw her standing near the staircase. "You're still up," he said, his tone neutral. "It's late. I was waiting," Maria said quietly. Her voice was steady, though her heart wasn't. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For you," she replied. He hesitated, clearly surprised. She had never confronted him like this. "I went into your study today," she said finally. His face changed almost imperceptibly, the slightest tightening around the jaw, "and I found the folder." For the first time in 2 years, Daniel Wright looked at her not as a polite stranger, but as a man caught off guard. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said slowly. "Maybe not," Maria answered. "But I did, and now I know everything. The emails, the deal, my father's offer, your acceptance, everything." He exhaled, ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment he looked tired, almost human. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "Your father was desperate and—" "Don't," Maria interrupted, her voice trembling now. "Don't justify it. You agreed, you signed, you bought me, and then you spent 2 years pretending it was something respectable." Silence hung between them like smoke. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. "You don't understand," he said finally. "There are things you don't know." "Then tell me," she demanded. "Because right now all I see is a man who traded my life for shares." He didn't answer. He simply turned and walked toward his study, leaving her standing there, heart pounding, tears burning behind her eyes. For a moment she wanted to chase him, to force him to speak. But then something inside her shifted. She realized she didn't need his explanations to reclaim her peace. That night Maria didn't sleep. She stayed by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. Somewhere between anger and acceptance, she made a decision. She would no longer live as a decoration in someone else's empire. She didn't know how, but she would find a way out. Not through rebellion or revenge, but through strength. Through building something of her own. And yet, as dawn broke and she saw Daniel standing in the driveway, speaking quietly on his phone before leaving again, she couldn't deny a small, painful truth. Part of her still wanted to understand him. Part of her still wanted to believe there was more beneath his silence. Because sometimes, even in the coldest marriage, a single truth can change everything. And neither of them knew it yet, but the change had already begun. The morning after Maria's discovery felt heavier than usual. The light entered the mansion with the same soft gold as always. Yet everything looked different. The colors seemed duller, the silence sharper, and every detail of that place reminded her of the truth she had uncovered. She walked through the house in slow steps, her bare feet making faint sounds on the marble, the same marble that had once felt elegant but now seemed like the polished skin of a cage. The flowers Daniel's assistant had delivered that morning stood perfectly arranged on the counter. White roses as always, untouched, flawless, and lifeless. She looked at them for a long moment before turning away, wondering if Daniel even remembered to order them or if someone in his company simply handled such gestures on his behalf. Daniel had left before sunrise again. She had heard the distant hum of his car in the driveway. Steady, predictable, cold. She had not slept all night. Every hour had been consumed by memories and questions. She tried to remember every conversation, every glance, every faint smile that might have hinted at some buried truth. Had there ever been real emotion behind his eyes? Or had everything been as calculated as the contract she found? She thought about confronting him again. But something inside her resisted. Maybe she wanted to see what he would do first. Whether he would pretend nothing happened or finally acknowledge what was broken between them. She sat down at her desk, opening her laptop to continue work on her wellness app. But her hands wouldn't move. The colors on the screen blurred. The project that once gave her peace now looked meaningless. How could she design calm for strangers when her own life was built on deceit? She closed the laptop and stared at the wall for what felt like hours. Then her phone vibrated. It was a message from Jennifer. "Thinking about you. If you need to escape, I'm here," Maria smiled faintly, grateful but unwilling to burden her friend further. She needed to face this alone. Around noon, Grace entered the room with her usual gentle presence. "Mrs. Wright," she said, her voice low. "Would you like me to prepare lunch?" Maria shook her head. "No, thank you, Grace." "I'm not hungry." Grace hesitated, her eyes full of understanding that came from years of silent observation. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the truth doesn't set us free immediately. It hurts first, but later, it becomes the thing that saves us." Maria looked up. Surprised by the wisdom in her voice, Grace smiled. "I've seen this house swallow people before. Don't let it swallow you, too." Then she turned and left quietly. The words stayed with Maria long after Grace disappeared down the hall. "Don't let it swallow you?" That night, when Daniel returned, she was waiting again. He entered wearing his usual charcoal gray suit, his expression unreadable when he saw her. There was a brief hesitation, as if he wasn't sure how to start. "Maria," he said, his tone careful. "We should talk." She crossed her arms. "Yes, we should." They sat opposite each other in the living room, the air thick with tension. Daniel exhaled slowly before speaking. "I know what you found," he began, "and I won't deny it. Your father did come to me with that proposal, and yes, I accepted, but not for the reasons you think." Maria's eyes narrowed. "You bought a wife to expand your business, Daniel." "How could there be another reason?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice lower now. "When I met your father, he was already sick. He knew his time was running out. He told me you didn't know about the debts, the lawsuits, the bankruptcy risk. He said he wanted to protect you, to leave you something stable. I told him I didn't want his shares. I didn't want a marriage built on trade, but he insisted. He said marrying you was the only way to keep Chen Industries alive. The only way to stop the board from tearing it apart. Maria stared at him, her breath uneven. You expect me to believe that you married me out of pity, she said bitterly. No, not pity, he answered. Responsibility. Your father saved my company years ago, before I became who I am. He risked everything on my first venture when no one else believed in me. When he asked me for this, I couldn't refuse him, she wanted to argue, to shout, to accuse him of twisting the story, but something about his voice stopped her. For the first time since she'd known him, it didn't sound like the smooth, confident tone of a businessman. It sounded human, strained, even guilty. Then why didn't you tell me, she whispered. Why make me live like a stranger in my own marriage? Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. Because I didn't want you to feel trapped. I thought distance was kindness if I gave you space. If I didn't demand anything from you, maybe one day you'd be free to leave if you wanted to. Maria laughed softly, the sound dry and painful. You call this freedom, she said. Living with someone who refuses to look me in the eye, who sends flowers through his assistant, who treats me like a symbol of obligation. That's not freedom, Daniel. That's punishment. He didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the floor. The silence between them stretched until Maria finally stood up. I don't know what's true anymore, she said, her voice trembling. But I can't live like this, not knowing where I stand. She turned to leave, but Daniel spoke again, his voice low. There's something else. Maria stopped but didn't turn around. What, she asked. He hesitated before saying, The night before your father died, he called me. He said he wanted to change the agreement. He wanted to give you full control of Chen Industries after a year. Regardless of my involvement, he said he had already told the lawyer, but before anything could be signed. He was gone. Maria froze, her heart thudded painfully. You're saying he planned to give it back to me? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, but no one ever found that addendum. And without it, the shares remained under my name. She turned to face him now, searching his eyes for deceit. And you didn't look for it, she said. He sighed. I did, I searched everywhere. But nothing surfaced, and after a while, the board grew restless. They wanted stability. I couldn't keep the company hanging on a rumor. Something in his tone felt sincere. Yet the ache in her chest remained. She walked away without another word, went upstairs and closed the door. That night she cried, not from anger but from exhaustion. Her heart was torn between disbelief and the faint whisper of understanding. The next morning Maria made a decision. She needed proof, something to confirm or deny Daniel's claim. She contacted her father's old lawyer, Mr. Alcott, a man with a warm voice and tired eyes who had known her since childhood. When she explained what she had found and what Daniel had said, he was silent for a long time. Maria, he finally said, I remember your father mentioning an amendment, but it was never signed. He kept the document draft in his personal safe, in his old office downtown, but after his death, the safe was sealed during the merger. You might still be able to access it if you're listed as next of kin. Maria felt her pulse quicken. Can you help me find it? She asked. He agreed to meet her the next day. That evening, when Daniel returned, she was already dressed to leave. Where are you going? He asked, noticing the determination in her eyes. To find the truth, she replied simply, and walked past him without another word. The drive downtown was long, the traffic thick, but inside the car, her thoughts were louder than the noise outside. The office building that once housed her father's company stood quiet now, its glass windows reflecting the gray clouds above. Mr. Alcott was waiting in the lobby with a folder of documents. We can access the safe through the archive department, he said, but you'll need to sign clearance forms. They walked through the dim hallways that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, past empty cubicles and framed photos of awards long forgotten. When they reached the archive room, an old metal safe sat in the corner. Maria's heart raced as she entered the code her father had once shown her when she was a child. To her astonishment, it still worked. The lock clicked open. Inside were stacks of files, photographs, and personal notes. She and Mr. Alcott went through them carefully, page by page, until finally, tucked inside a brown envelope, she found it, a draft agreement with her father's handwriting, dated just a week before his death. It stated that all Chen Industries assets and shares were to be transferred to Maria Chen Wright within 1 year of her marriage. signed only by Robert Chen, the second signature line, for Daniel Wright, was blank. Her hands shook as she stared at it. "He wasn't lying," she whispered. The lawyer nodded slowly. "It seems he intended for you to inherit everything." But the document was never finalized. On the drive home, Maria's thoughts spiraled. Daniel hadn't lied, at least not entirely. He had known the truth but chosen silence. Maybe he wanted to protect her from the chaos, or maybe he feared what that truth would mean for their fragile arrangement. Whatever his reason, she could no longer see him as just a heartless man. There was complexity in his choices, pain even. When she entered the mansion that evening, Daniel was waiting in the living room, as if he knew she would return with answers. She placed the document on the table in front of him. "I found it," she said quietly. His eyes flickered down, and for a moment he looked relieved. "So it was real," he murmured. "Your father wasn't lying." "No," she said. "But you could have told me. You could have trusted me with the truth." He looked up at her, and in his gaze she saw something raw, something unguarded. "You were grieving," he said softly. "You had lost everything. I didn't want you to think I was using your father's memory to control you. I thought staying silent would keep you safe." Maria's lips parted, but no words came. There was so much pain between them, so much unsaid. She realized then that they had both been prisoners. She of betrayal, he of guilt. For 2 years, silence had built walls between them. But now cracks had begun to appear, small, fragile cracks through which truth could finally breathe. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Daniel leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Now," he said, "we rebuild." "If you'll let me." She didn't answer. Not yet. She needed time. She needed to feel what it meant to trust again. But for the first time since her marriage began, the house didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place where change might finally happen. That night as she lay awake, she thought of her father, of the decisions that bound them all together, of Daniel's tired eyes when he spoke of guilt, and of her own heart slowly learning that truth, even when painful, was better than silence. And somewhere in that fragile peace between anger and forgiveness, Maria Chen Wright took her first breath of freedom. The days that followed were filled with an unfamiliar silence, not the cold emptiness that had once haunted the Wright mansion, but a softer silence, one that carried questions, reflection, and the first hints of something fragile trying to be born. Maria felt the weight between her and Daniel shifting. It was as though both had stepped to the edge of a long forbidden truth, neither ready to cross but no longer willing to turn away. She woke earlier than usual, her eyes drawn to the morning light seeping through the curtains, and for the first time, she noticed how warm it looked when it touched the edges of the bed. Her life had always been built around routines, but now every moment felt uncertain, unpredictable, alive in a strange way. Daniel had started coming home earlier, sometimes by 7, sometimes even before sunset, and though he said little, his presence felt different, softer, less mechanical. One evening, Maria found him standing near the piano, the one she had never touched, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He looked lost in thought. "You play?" she asked quietly. He turned to her, almost startled, and gave a faint smile. "I used to," he said. "My mother taught me when I was a kid." She stepped closer, surprised to hear something so human from him. "Why did you stop?" she asked. He paused, looking down at the keys. "Because she died," he said simply, "and after that, music just hurt too much." Something inside Maria softened. She had never known much about his past, about the man behind the empire. "How old were you?" she asked. He kept his gaze on the piano. 17, he said. "She was everything. The only family I really had. My father was strict, obsessed with work, always telling me emotion was weakness. When she passed, he told me to bury the pain and focus on the future. I did, and I never stopped. Maybe that's why I became who I am." Maria stood there, her chest tightening. She saw now the reason behind his silence. The coldness wasn't cruelty. It was protection, a way of surviving pain that had never been healed. She sat beside him on the bench, her shoulder barely touching his, and whispered, "You don't have to keep burying it, Daniel." For a moment he didn't move. Then he turned slightly toward her, their eyes meeting, and in that single look, years of distance seemed to collapse. That night neither spoke much, but something unspoken filled the air. A quiet understanding that they were both broken in ways the other might finally help mend. The next morning, Maria decided to take back her life piece by piece. She reopened her wellness project, redesigning it not for clients or investors, but for herself. She wanted to build an app that spoke to people who lived behind smiles, who looked successful but were silently drowning inside. She named it Breathe Again. Each color she chose, each sound she tested felt like therapy. Not just for her, but for the ghosts of her father's mistakes and Daniel's silence. Daniel noticed the change one evening as he passed her office. He paused at the door, watching her work. "You seem different lately," he said. "Lighter," she smiled faintly. "Maybe because for the first time—" "I'm not pretending," he nodded. "That's good." Then after a pause, "You know, I could help you with the funding if you want." She looked up, half amused, half touched. "You already fund half my life." "Daniel," she said softly, "this one I want to build alone." He smiled then, a real smile, small and uncertain, but real nonetheless, and it made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. As the weeks passed, they began to share small fragments of life that had never existed between them before. Dinner conversations that once consisted of polite phrases now stretched into long talks about work, art, even memories. Daniel told her about the early days of his company, the nights he slept in his car, the people who laughed at his dreams. Maria listened, realizing that beneath his armor of confidence lay a man who had learned to fight the world alone. And when she spoke of her father, of how much she had loved him despite his flaws, Daniel listened with quiet respect, never interrupting, never dismissing her pain. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maria returned home to find the lights dimmed and the faint sound of piano music drifting through the house. She followed it to the living room, and there he was, playing softly, his hands moving over the keys like a confession. She stood by the doorway, tears forming before she could stop them. When the song ended, he looked up. "I didn't think I remembered how," he said quietly, "but I guess some things never leave you." She walked closer, her voice barely a whisper. "It's beautiful." He smiled faintly. She used to say music was how we tell the truth when words fail. Maria sat beside him again, neither speaking, both lost in the sound that filled the room. It was the first moment of peace they had shared, not as strangers or business partners, but as two souls finding their way back to feeling. But peace never lasts easily. The world beyond their mansion still carried the noise of expectations. One afternoon, Daniel received a call that would shake their fragile balance. It was from his board of directors. A hostile investor was trying to seize control of Wright Enterprises. They wanted to exploit rumors of internal conflict between him and his wife, and merge Chen Industries completely into their brand, destroying the Chen legacy in the process. Daniel knew that once the story spread, it would not only threaten his company, but also humiliate Maria publicly. That evening, Maria found him pacing the study, his jaw tight, his voice low as he spoke on the phone. "No, don't release anything yet," he said sharply. "I'll handle it personally." When he ended the call, he turned to her, his face pale with worry. "There's a problem," he said. "Someone's leaking information about us, about our marriage." "About your father's company?" Maria frowned. "What kind of information?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Enough to destroy both companies if it reaches the media. They're calling our marriage a fraud, saying it was arranged for money." She froze. "But it was," she whispered. He looked at her, pain flickering in his eyes. "It was, but it isn't anymore. Not for me." The words hung in the air like thunder. Maria felt her breath catch. He took a step closer. "Maria, I know I failed you. I know I gave you a life built on lies, but somewhere along the way, you became the only truth I have left." She wanted to speak, to say something, but emotion locked her throat. The sincerity in his voice struck something deep within her. The next day, Daniel went into full damage control mode, meeting lawyers, board members, and PR teams. He refused to let Maria be dragged into the chaos, but the headlines had already begun to swirl. Billionaire's marriage a business deal? Was love just a contract? Maria's phone flooded with messages, journalists waiting outside the gates, and whispers followed her everywhere she went online. She wanted to hide, but she didn't. Instead, she walked into Daniel's study late that night, where he sat staring at his computer, shoulders tense. "Let me speak," she said. He looked up sharply. "No, you don't have to." "I do," she interrupted. "Because this story isn't just about you, it's about me, too." The next morning, Maria held a press conference, simple and direct. Dressed in a plain white dress, her hair pulled back, She stood before the cameras and said, "Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement. My father made that choice, not me. But what no one will tell you is that truth can evolve, that people can change. I won't apologize for the past, but I won't let it define my future." Her voice was calm, steady, filled with quiet strength. She looked directly into the cameras. "I am Maria Chen Wright. I was not bought. I was not traded. I am a woman rebuilding her life, and the company that bears my family's name will continue to honor his vision." The room was silent for a moment before applause broke from one corner. Reporters nodding, cameras flashing. In that moment, Maria didn't feel like a pawn anymore. She felt like herself, whole and free. When she returned home, Daniel was waiting at the door, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I wanted to," she replied, "because for the first time, I'm not ashamed of the truth." He looked at her for a long time, then took a slow step forward, stopping just inches away. "You were incredible," he said softly. "You saved everything." Maria felt her heart race. "We saved it," she corrected gently. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since they had married, the distance between them vanished completely. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. Hesitant but real, she didn't pull away. The touch felt like sunlight breaking through years of shadow. That night they sat together on the balcony. No walls, no silence, only the quiet hum of the city below. Daniel told her everything about his fears. His guilt and his past. She listened, not as a stranger, but as someone who finally understood. They talked until the stars began to fade, and when dawn came, Maria realized something she never thought possible, that forgiveness could be the beginning of love. The mansion that had once been filled with cold air now carried warmth, laughter, and life again. It wasn't perfect, and the scars between them would take time to heal. But they were no longer pretending. They were learning slowly and painfully to touch not just with hands but with truth. And somewhere deep within both their hearts, beneath all the storms, a quiet hope began to rise. The kind that comes only when two broken souls finally learn that love isn't found in perfection, but in the courage to begin again. The weeks that followed the press conference changed everything for Daniel and Maria. Their names were no longer whispered with scandal but spoken with admiration. The world that once saw them as a symbol of corporate greed now saw a couple rebuilding from honesty. But what the public didn't know was that the real transformation was happening inside the quiet walls of the Wright mansion. The house that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with a softer rhythm, a presence that could be felt even in silence. There was laughter sometimes, faint but real, footsteps that no longer avoided each other, and glances that stayed longer than before. Maria began spending her mornings in the garden, planting herbs and small flowers, something she had always dreamed of doing but never dared because she thought it would be pointless in such a perfect, artificial life. Now she found beauty in the dirt under her nails, in the scent of mint and lavender carried by the breeze. It was healing, tangible, alive. Daniel often watched her from the terrace, a faint smile forming whenever she knelt by the soil with the sun shining in her hair. There was something grounding about her presence, something that reminded him that success wasn't measured in profit but in peace. One evening, when the sky turned golden and the air grew cool, Maria looked up from her garden and saw Daniel walking toward her. He wasn't in one of his tailored suits this time, but in a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up. He crouched beside her, glancing at the small patch of green she had been nurturing. "You've changed this place," he said softly. "It finally feels like a home." She smiled faintly, brushing soil from her hands. "Homes are built by hearts, not architects," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment, the setting sun painting a faint glow across his face. "Then maybe it's time I start building mine," he said quietly. From that day onward, something invisible began to bloom between them. It wasn't sudden, nor was it perfect. It was slow, delicate, like the way dawn chases away the night. They began to share meals together more often, sometimes in silence, sometimes with small conversations about ordinary things that felt extraordinary, simply because they were real. Maria found herself laughing one night when Daniel tried to cook and nearly burned the pasta. He looked embarrassed, but she couldn't stop laughing. And when she laughed, he joined in, their voices filling the kitchen with warmth. There were still moments when shadows crept in, reminders of the wounds they both carried. Sometimes Maria would wake up at night, her heart pounding from dreams of betrayal and loss, and she would sit by the window, staring at the city lights, wondering if trust could ever be complete. One night, as she sat there, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. Daniel appeared at the door, his expression soft. "Couldn't sleep again?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm living someone else's life," she admitted. He walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the lights with her. "Maybe we both are," he said. "But we're trying to write our own story now. And that's what matters." He stayed beside her that night, not touching her, not speaking much, just sitting there, watching the sky slowly lighten with dawn. And for Maria, that simple companionship felt like more than any grand gesture ever could. Days turned into weeks, and one evening, as rain began to fall softly outside, Maria was working in her studio when Daniel knocked on the door. He held 2 cups of coffee. "Peace offering," he said with a faint smile. She took one and smiled back. "What's the occasion?" she teased. "No occasion," he said. "I just wanted to see you." He hesitated then, as if gathering courage. "There's something I need to tell you." Maria set the cup down and turned to face him. He took a deep breath. "Before your father came to me about the arrangement, I had already known you." Her brows furrowed. "Known me how?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Not personally, but I'd seen your work. Your designs were part of a wellness startup I once invested in anonymously. You created something that made people feel safe, peaceful. I remember thinking whoever designed this must understand pain deeply. I didn't know it was you until your father came to my office." Maria stared at him, her pulse quickening. "So you knew who I was when he made the deal," she said quietly. He nodded. "Yes. And that's why I hesitated. I wanted to refuse, but I also wanted to protect you. I knew your father's company was collapsing, and I thought maybe somehow I could fix it. But when you walked into my life, everything I planned fell apart. Because you weren't what I expected. You were strong, kind, so full of quiet strength that it scared me." Maria felt her throat tighten. "Then why didn't you ever say this?" she whispered. He looked away. "Because I didn't deserve to. Not after how it all began. I didn't want you to think I was trying to win you over with sympathy." His voice broke slightly. "You were the first person who ever made me want to feel again. And I didn't know how." The room fell silent, only the sound of rain filling the space between them. Maria's eyes filled with tears, not of pain this time, but of something she couldn't quite name. She took a step closer. "Daniel," she said softly, "we both lived behind walls for too long. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." He met her gaze, and for the first time there was no distance, no armor, only truth. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and when his fingers brushed her cheek, she didn't pull away. She closed her eyes as he whispered, "I'm sorry for every day I made you feel unwanted." She opened her eyes and shook her head gently. "And I'm sorry for every day I didn't try to understand you." It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was something purer. The breaking of barriers that had stood between them for years. They stood there as thunder rumbled faintly outside, his hand still on her cheek, her breath trembling, and when he leaned closer, their foreheads touched, just a small gesture, but it carried the weight of forgiveness. Later that night, when they sat together on the couch, the rain still whispering against the windows, Daniel spoke softly. "Do you remember the piano?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Play with me," he said. She hesitated. "I don't know how." He smiled faintly. "Then let me teach you." They sat at the piano together, his hands guiding hers gently over the keys, showing her how to find the right notes. The melody that filled the room was simple, unpolished, but beautiful. Maria laughed when she pressed the wrong key, and Daniel laughed too, and the sound of their laughter mixed with the music, blending into something tender and real. As the night deepened, the laughter faded into silence, the kind of silence that carried warmth instead of emptiness. Daniel looked at her, his voice low. "You've changed me, Maria." She smiled. "Maybe we changed each other." They stayed like that for a long time, the melody repeating softly until words no longer felt necessary. Outside, the rain stopped, and moonlight broke through the clouds. Washing over them in silver light, Maria closed her eyes, breathing deeply, realizing that the mansion, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a heart finally learning to beat again. And in that quiet, rain-washed night, something invisible yet undeniable took root between them. Not just love, but a deep understanding that neither success nor status could ever give. It was the kind of connection born not from perfection, but from two souls that had seen each other's pain and chosen to stay. The summer air was warm and slow that evening, carrying the faint scent of the sea from the hills beyond the city. The Wright mansion no longer felt like a monument of silence, but like a place quietly breathing again. Its walls holding laughter, the echo of piano keys, the hum of conversations that no longer ended too soon. For Maria, the days had begun to feel different. Every sunrise like a quiet invitation to start over. She spent her mornings watering her garden, her afternoons refining the final touches of her wellness app, and her evenings walking through the house that now felt alive. The loneliness that had once wrapped itself around her heart had begun to dissolve, replaced by something softer, something she had never dared to imagine. Peace. Daniel had changed too. The man who had once lived behind a wall of order and routine had started to let himself be human again. He smiled more easily. He laughed without restraint. And sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, he would stop to watch her work with a kind of admiration that spoke louder than words. Yet even with all this closeness, there was still one invisible line between them, a quiet hesitation born from the years of distance, both of them feeling it, both afraid to cross it too soon because love, they had learned, was not a thing to be demanded, but something that needed to grow at its own pace. One evening, the sky turned amber as the sun slipped low behind the horizon, painting everything with a soft golden light. Maria stood on the balcony watching the city shimmer below, her hair moving gently in the wind. She felt him before she heard him. Daniel's quiet footsteps approaching. He stopped beside her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water with lemon. "You always forget to drink," he said with a faint smile. She smiled back, taking the glass from him. "And you never forget to remind me." They stood there together, looking out over Los Angeles as the first stars began to appear. "It's strange," she said softly. "This view used to make me feel small. Now it feels like a reminder that life can start again." Daniel glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the same fading light. "That's because you started it again," he said. "You taught me how." They stayed like that for a while, not talking, just breathing in the same rhythm, and in that silence, something in the air shifted. It was not sudden, it was quiet, like the slow unfolding of trust. Maria turned slightly toward him, her gaze meeting his. "Do you ever think about the beginning?" she asked. "About how far we've come?" He nodded, his voice low. "Every day, and I hate what I did, but I thank fate for the second chance." She looked down, her fingers tracing the cool edge of the balcony rail. "I used to think I would never forgive you," she said, "but forgiveness turned out to be the only way I could free myself." He reached out then, slowly, hesitantly, and when his hand brushed hers, she didn't pull away. His fingers closed, around hers with the gentleness of someone holding something fragile and irreplaceable. They went inside as the wind picked up. The house glowed softly under the dim lights, the rain from a distant storm tapping faintly on the windows. Daniel led her toward the living room where the piano still stood. "Do you want to play?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight I just want to talk." They sat on the couch facing each other, the faint sound of thunder in the distance. "Maria," he began, his voice rough, "I spent so many years believing that love was weakness, that it would distract me, that it would take away control. But when you came into my life, you showed me that love is the only thing that keeps us human." He looked at her with eyes that no longer hid behind success or pride. "You made me want to live, not just survive." Maria felt tears gather in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "And you," she whispered. "You taught me that even after betrayal, people can change, that broken things can still be made whole." He reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet between them. "We wasted so much time," she murmured. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe the time we spent lost was what taught us how to find each other now." The thunder rolled closer, the lights flickered once, and the room was filled with the soft rhythm of rain. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm. "It's funny," he said, "how storms used to unsettle me. I used to think they ruined the order of things. Now I think they're necessary. They remind us that after the noise comes calm." Maria joined him at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm. "Maybe we were both a storm," she said, "and now it's finally time for calm." He turned to her slowly, his voice quiet but full of weight. "I don't want to live another day without telling you this, Maria. I love you." The words hung in the air like a release, the kind of truth that had waited years to be spoken. Maria froze, her heart pounding, tears spilling freely now. "Daniel," she whispered, "you don't have to say that because of guilt." He shook his head, stepping closer. "I'm saying it because it's the only thing I've ever been sure of." Her breath caught, the emotion in his voice cutting through every wall she had ever built. She took a step toward him, then another, until she was close enough to feel his heartbeat. "You waited 2 years to say that," she whispered, half laughing, half crying. "I was afraid," he said. "I thought if I said it, it would break whatever fragile peace we had. But now I realize love isn't the end of peace. It's what gives it meaning." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the soft light. "Then don't wait anymore," she said simply. And in that moment, everything changed. He reached for her slowly, his hand cupping her face. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as a single tear slipped down her cheek. And when he kissed her, it was not the kiss of passion born from desire, but of two souls finally finding their way home. It was gentle, trembling, full of every unspoken word and every healed wound. The world outside continued to rumble with rain and thunder, but inside time seemed to stop. They stayed like that for a long while, the storm fading into silence, and when they finally parted, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes said everything, and that this was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a real one. Later that night, they sat together on the floor by the fireplace. The flames flickering softly, Daniel held her hand, his thumb tracing light circles against her skin. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I used to think empires were built by strength, but they're built by love, by trust. By someone who believes in you even when you don't." Maria smiled through her tears. "Then we'll build ours differently," she said. "Not with contracts, but with faith." The fire crackled. Shadows danced on the walls, and for the first time since their wedding, Maria leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. Closing her eyes, she felt his arm wrap around her gently, holding her the way a man holds the one person he never wants to lose. Outside, the city glowed under the quiet aftermath of rain, and above them the moon broke through the clouds. Casting silver light into the room, Maria thought about the journey that had brought them here. The lies, the betrayal, the discovery, the pain, and finally the truth. She realized that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most peaceful destinations, and that love, real love, is not about perfection, but about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. Daniel looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She smiled, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for finding me when I was lost." The night stretched on, gentle and endless, filled with the sound of their quiet breathing, and when dawn finally touched the horizon, painting gold across the city, the mansion stood bathed in light, no longer a symbol of power but a home, alive with warmth and laughter. Maria opened her eyes, feeling Daniel's heartbeat steady beneath her hand, and in that heartbeat she heard everything she had once searched for. Love, forgiveness, peace, and the strength to begin again. And so, the woman who once lived in silence and the man who once feared emotion finally learned that the truest kind of passion is not born in the fire of desire, but in the gentle courage of two souls choosing to heal together. Their story was no longer about money, power, or appearances. It was about redemption, trust, and the simple, extraordinary miracle of love that comes not at first sight, but at the moment when two broken hearts finally dare to believe again.